This Fed Gov Today program is sponsored by NDIA, the National Defense Industrial Association. On this edition of Fed Gov Today with Francis Rose, maybe AI isn't all about the data after all.
We could see something out of the blue where it's no longer just about scale, no longer about just more data and just more compute. There is a different way.
Former director of the Jack Shanahan on Fed Gov Today in just a moment. You can join Defense Innovators August 27th through 29th in Washington, D.C. for the NDIA Emerging Technologies for Defense Conference. It features a great lineup of top government leaders, classified briefings, and a new global defense hackathon. You can see the current lineup and register at ndiatechexpo.org. That's ndiatechexpo.org. AI applications across government are getting a lot cheaper this week. The General Services Administration has agreements with several vendors at heavily discounted rates for the next year. Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan, U.S. Air Force retired, is former director of the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. Jack, welcome. Great to have you back on the program. What's your takeaway from these agreements that GSA has struck with these AI companies? Welcome, Jack.
Well, first, Francis, thank you for having me back. It has been a little while, so I'm really happy to have this conversation with you. I'll start by saying I'll separate this into two categories that I think overlap, but it's a little hard to tell based on the reporting coming out of both the Pentagon and GSA. The first one is the sort of $200 million, what we'd call IDIQs, indefinite quantity and indefinite delivery, whatever, contracts for these models to be developed with the Defense Department. That's on one side. And then this more recent announcement, and they're not far apart, they're a couple of weeks apart, about OpenAI and Anthropic offering their services of these models for $1 per department or agency, which is a really big deal. So both of these are pretty significant developments. And let me, if you don't mind, just a little bit on how I'll tackle those separately. I do have to look at the world differently for, say, GSA and many of the departments of agencies in the government using these models in an experimental way. That's something I would highly, highly encourage. It goes back, Francis, to conversations you and I have had in the past about minimal viable product. How do you do this? The best possible way is turn these capabilities over as quickly as possible to the user. I'll say warfighter for the Defense Department, intel community, but generally user for the government. Let them play around with them. But that comes with some caveats, mostly in the form of experimentation, pilot stage, get comfortable with the tools, and then start putting them in operation. Where I draw a little bit of a brighter line is where I would start looking at these in life and death situations, either in intelligence community and the Defense Department, where I really will say, yes, use them, experiment, let's play around with them, but we also have to learn what works and what doesn't work with them. And we should anticipate that those models have to be trained a little bit differently once they're in the government to bring in, say, data that only the intelligence community has, data that only the Defense Department has. These models were not trained on that data. So whether you call it tuning or these other terms like retrieval, augmented generation, doesn't matter. But the models themselves can be extraordinarily useful in a sort of little bit more, narrow sense. But to really start getting at the Defense Department and intel community missions, you need to be trained a little bit more specifically. So I'm a big fan of doing this. It does come with some complicating factors. As I read, I think Wired just did a big story on this saying, well, we're not sure these are approved for use yet in terms of a FedRAMP, a process you're very familiar with, that every company recoils at the very name of FedRAMP and what it takes to be accredited and authorized to operate, or ATO. So that may take a little bit longer, especially when you're talking about the intel world and the DoD, to get these things authorized on the appropriate networks. But in general, in principle, I almost say this is like Cold War détente, when one company didn't move until they wanted to see another company do it. But once the first company went for $1, now you're going to see everybody piling on, because we start looking at what vendors get access to the government, and is it a preferred treatment for them, which opens a can of worms or two.
One of the things that I know was very important to you when you were running the Jake, and we've talked about it many times in the conversations that you and I have had subsequent to that, Jack, is what happens to the broader industrial base as the result of the actions of one company. And that's what I thought about when I first saw this. Okay, what about smaller companies that the Defense Department says on an ongoing basis it wants to incorporate into the DIB, that the GSA says all the time they want to incorporate into the base that supports the federal government? What about the companies that are smaller, less mature than the Anthropics of the world, and maybe can't afford to give their services for? I mean, it's not $1. It's basically the way that the companies can do this, can give this to the government free without giving it free. But what about companies that can't give their IP away, can't afford to do that for a year? What is the implication potentially for the industrial base more broadly, in your view?
Well, when it comes to these, what we would normally say a term of frontier model or reasoning model, I'm going to be candid. The deck is stacked against everybody else because the big companies, the Anthropics, the OpenAIs, the Googles, they have access to all the compute. They have access to all the data. The deck is always going to be stacked in their favor and against the smaller companies with respect to these frontier models. That's unfortunate. So what it really is going to force some of the smaller tech companies to do is either get into partnerships with these bigger countries, or this is also, I see this happening pretty regularly, find the niche capabilities they can bring into the department that will also say you can use those big models for those broad questions that you might have. How to do contracting in the government is a great use of a frontier model that GSA would be thrilled to have that everywhere in the government. But for specific purposes, we will open the door to more companies to come in and talk to you. But I think it is a constructive critique to say when it comes to frontier models, the door is not open to everybody. It is not, and I don't think it ever will be, just based on the money they have available, the compute they have available, and the talent they have available. So it will take a different approach. Doesn't mean that there aren't, in a Project Maven-like way, small companies out there bringing in certain capabilities that are not frontier models. They're AI capabilities, technologies of some type that could be extremely useful for the department or for the intel community, but it won't be this frontier model piece.
What I take heart from your analysis at the beginning of this conversation, Jack, is you essentially said the same things about what you would like to see with deployment of these tools, with testing and experimentation. You said the same thing that you've said in basically every conversation that we've had about using AI tools. So what I guess is comforting to me, and probably, I imagine, to the people who are going to be overseeing, governing the use of them inside the agencies, is there's nothing about the model, the acquisition model, that should inform or inhibit the way that the agencies think about using the tools. Is that a fair read on my part? Am I making that connection right?
You are making a connection, right, Francis? But let me take it a step further, too, and say what I do think about. And, I'll give props to Brandy Vincent at Defense Scoop for writing about this about a week ago. What is the testing process that the government is going to go through with these models? That brings in some pretty big questions that demand answers from the big companies, like what are you turning over to the government? As I understand it, they're not turning over the raw model weights. That's just not something they're going to do. They're not going to turn over what data they use to train those models. So what are they going to do? They're going to come in the door and say that we've done pretty extensive test and evaluation and red teaming. I think those both would be something the companies would come in the door right away and say, we've done that. That's good. But just as you and I have talked about in the past, back in my Maven days, Jake days, that's good. But it's a trust but verify. You still have to have the government do its own test and evaluation and its red teaming because of the life and death consequences of these capabilities once they're put into use. So what I really hope it is, and so far I see no reason to believe it's otherwise, is the companies will work hand in glove with the government to go through this process. But at some point, there really has to be a disinterested third-party assessment to say, we agree with how that was trained, but the government also needs to do a little bit more to ensure the models will perform as advertised. That's still a little bit unclear right now what that process is going to look like. But as you say, Fran, I'm glad you pointed out, because it's near and dear to my heart that I have never come off this narrative of the importance of test and evaluation. It can be done quickly. It can be done at the speed of relevance. But these things are so important now to the future of the government that we can't just assume away that the companies have done everything to the government's, desire, so to speak.
Are you concerned at all about the possibility of either the company jacking up the prices a year from now on the agencies, or building the terms and conditions in such a way that it's really hard for folks to get their data out if they decide they want to move to a different platform?
Well, this is an audio-only podcast, I believe, Francis. But I'm showing you my shocked face of what
Right.
a company a year from now would decide that it goes from $1 to $100,000 a license. Oldest game in the book for a technology company.
Right.
So yes, I would not expect free services to extend forever. That won't be. What they're hoping to do is get some sort of lock-in, of course, and if they get the business that others don't get, then they can start do the frog in the boiling water, raise that temperature a little bit, and just start charging more over time. Yes, that is. I'll let the government deal with that, but yes, I saw that more than once or twice in my experience.
Are there ways that the agencies can protect themselves, or at least protect themselves to some degree, against that, short of just saying you're going to have to change the T&C, which I can't imagine the companies would be in too big a hurry to do?
No, they're going to have to do something like, okay, here's the year. And I'm not sure what those terms are right now,
Sure.
but as they get, let's say 6 months out, who knows the speed of government contracting, that to start working on the next version of this. And look, I'll play a little bit of devil's advocate here and come in on the company's behalf. There are now so many open source models that are out there. They could lose just by the nature of somebody else is out there with a cheaper and equally capable, I'm not going to say better, but I'll say equally capable as the Chinese company DeepSeek has already proven. So yes, if Anthropic and OpenAI are worried about that's legitimate concern, and they're there to make money, and it's a business. So I would take both sides of this and say, look, the government has to get the terms correct, and they could expect the prices to go up. But it is a very Darwinian process in this frontier reasoning world right now. Now, I would also make the case as a government, that's great. You've done all of this at the unclassified open source level or open model close. At some point, we start talking national security. That is no longer an open model. It is going to be protected. Almost start looking at this as like a national security priority. That brings an entirely different way of looking at the problem set.
Yeah, I've had some folks from CIA on the program talking about AI over the last couple of months. And my takeaway from those conversations is that's what they're doing. Like when they started using AI tools inside the agency, at first, I don't know where they are today, but at first they were only using their own proprietary data. And they were using, I want to say they were using an off-the-shelf AI product, but then everything was firewalled that they were only using information of their own, both to train the tool purposefully on CIA data and then just to prevent any commingling issues in that same respect.
I would expect nothing less with any government agency that has business beyond the unclassified realm. That's just the way you have to do it.
All right. The DeepSeek thing that you mentioned a moment ago. So DeepSeek comes basically out of nowhere, a year, 8 months ago, something like that. And it was hot in the United States for about 3 days, and then everybody figured out, oh, this is a scam that China's perpetrating on us, like a lot of the other things that they perpetrated on us. And then DeepSeek kind of went away, and I don't hear much discussion of it anymore. But what is informative in my view about that is it's conceivable to me that another company that we don't know that exists today, that's an American company that's on the up and up, could conceivably come out of nowhere and be as viable as the companies that are on these deals. What's the potential implication of, for example, if let's just say DeepSeek, it was a legitimate company, agencies would want to use it. It might not cost $1. It might be a completely different thing than we're used to now. Do you see in these deals the possibility of an on-ramp that some other technology, maybe even, that is the next generation after generative artificial intelligence? I guess the most succinct way to answer it is, what is the growth trajectory that's possible here, both from a scaling perspective and from a technological perspective into things that we might not even know exist today?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, you might hear about DeepSeek again fairly soon with their R2 model that's rumored to be coming out in the next month or less. So don't give up on DeepSeek. It was a wake-up call. I think a very refreshing wake-up call to say, look, they've been restricted in their access to chips thanks to export controls and some other sanctions that have been put on by the administration, and they came and found a different way of getting to a pretty good end result that may not be quite as good as the very best closed models that are tech companies. And then another, I think, was Singapore. Kimi K2 is another model that has sort of said, opened some eyes that said, they are meeting all the benchmarks. Now, with both of those, we should stay away from them from any government purposes. I do not want a Chinese model being used in any government system, period. That's just bad news. However, I think what they did is very interesting, very creative, very innovative, and we will expect more to that. That's the heart of the answer to your question is we should expect a lot more of this. And I actually have been kicking over this idea of the opportunity cost of just going scale, and $500 billion to build data centers somewhere around the world. Is that necessarily the best use of that money, or are there alternative ways of developing these capabilities? The jury's out. I'll be honest with you. I don't know the answer. I think the big tech companies are looking seriously at that, but I like the idea of an upstart coming and slapping people in the face and saying, you did it all wrong. Let me give you an alternative. In the United States, there are companies like that. It'll be so hard for them because they're going to be crushed by the big tech companies. But I think we could see something out of the blue where it's no longer just about scale, no longer about just more data and just more compute. There is a different way, which others would say is some hybrid neurosymbolic. We don't have to get into the details of what that all means. But I do think in the next year, we will see some more surprises that will shake up the industry.
Is there a way to prepare for those, or is that not constructive because we just don't know what they're going to be and therefore it's impossible to plan for?
It's an excellent question. Here's how I'd answer it. The lesson we should take away from all this is to be as agile as possible and to be ready to move on a moment's notice, which is, how hard that is for the government once it's into a procurement and contracting cycle. But that's why we don't want to get locked into anything. We may be in a position as a government in a year to say, you know what, that's not it anymore. We're going to go somewhere else. But that means you need leaders who are they're not risk averse, they're risk tolerant, and you have leaders that will support people making those sort of bold decisions about, look, that's not it anymore. Let's make a decision to move to something else. So that is going to take. It's a leadership question. It's a culture question, and the answer is let's find the right people that are adaptive and agile and willing to turn on a dime, so to speak.
I always love talking to you, Jack. I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. We'll see you next time.
You can read more about the discounted AI deals and AI use across government on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. The Department of Defense is revitalizing a NASA concept for the 21st century. The technology readiness level will help the department, quote, evaluate technology readiness for humans. Chris DeLuca, Director of Specialty Engineering in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, will tell you about it on the next Fed Gov Today TV. You can watch the debut on ABC7 in Washington and on the Fed Gov Today YouTube channel at 10:30 Eastern Time Sunday morning. If you miss the debut, you can watch anytime at fedgovtoday.com and on YouTube. The next Fed Gov Today podcast is coming tomorrow. New executive leadership tools are out from OPM. To learn about them and how you can use them most effectively, follow the Fed Gov Today podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. And you can always listen on demand at fedgovtoday.com. I'm Francis Rose. Thanks very much for listening.